we're going to go back to the this keyword and learn how we can set the this keyword manually, and also why we would want to do that. So let's say we are an airline again, and in this case Lufthansa, which is the biggest European airline group, by the way. And so let's create a very simple object for this airline with a very simple booking method as well. So we have the airline name, we have the code, basically. We also want to keep an array of bookings, so also inside of the object, and then the book method. And remember from the previous section, I will now start using the way of writing methods using the enhanced object literal syntax. And so that's simply by defining the method like this without having to write function. So remember, before this, we used to do this, right? And if you still prefer this syntax, you can still do this one, but I do actually prefer the new syntax. And so I'll just start using this one now. So the flight number and also the passenger name here. So then let's log something to the console. And again, this could have been boilerplate code here, but it's also good to practice writing this. So this should be a template string, booked a seat on. So basically we want to print like Jonas booked a seat on Lufthansa flight and then the flight number. And so here we are now going to get the airline name from the object. And so we already learned that for that we use the this keyword, right? And then flight this dot IATA code. So that's going to be the LH and then the flight number itself that we pass into the function. So the flight number. So for now, this is just a nice review of how the this keyword works, right? And of course, I will now assume that you know how all of this works, because otherwise I will have to explain the same things over and over again. And so, as I mentioned before, you should only progress once you really understand a certain topic. Anyway, let's now use the book function here, and I will use the flight number 239, and then with my own name. And let's right away book another Lufthansa flight for, let's say, Mike Smith on flight number 635. John Smith. And now if we take a look at the results, then indeed, everything works just as expected, right? And so it's important to understand that the this keyword here points to the Lufthansa object itself, because that's the object on which the book method here was called. So again, that's just what I explained before, right? But now let's say that after some years, the Lufthansa group created a new airline. So let's create Eurowings here. And then a very similar object. So with the airline, the code, and also an empty bookings array. Okay. Oh, and by the way, we actually also want our book method here to add a new object to our bookings here. So that's super important as well. So I forgot that. So let's go back here. So we will say again this, and then the bookings array. And then let's push a new object in there with the flight. And so that's essentially going to be this one. So the code plus the flight number. And then also the passenger name. And then let's quickly log that to the console here. So this.bookings is not a function, and of course it's not. We need the push method indeed. And so now you see that we have an array of our two bookings here. So that works perfectly. But now, anyway, going back here to Eurowings, of course, we also want to be able to take bookings for a Eurowings flight. So as being this airline, right? Now, taking this exact same method here and simply copying it and pasting it here is a bad practice, right? So, of course, we are not going to do that. So instead, we will just take the method and store it in an external function. And then we can reuse that function for all of the different airlines. So what I mean is to create a new function called book, and we will simply set it to Lufthansa.book. All right? So again, this is possible because JavaScript has first-class functions. And so we can simply take this function value here, so that's this function, and then store it into a new variable, which is then going to be also the book function. Okay? Now we could have written the function here also literally, but that's just not necessary. We have it right here, and so let's just leave it there and assign it to book right here. Okay, so let's try to use this book function to do a new booking now. But what do you think is going to happen? So 23, and then let's say Sarah Williams. Let's give it a save. And now we get cannot read property airline of undefined. So do you know why this happened? Well, it's because this function here, the book function, is now just a regular function call. And so as we learned in one of the previous sections, in a regular function call, the this keyword points to undefined, at least in strict mode. All right? So once more, this book function is no longer this method. Okay? It's just not. It is now this separate function here. It's a copy of this one, but it's not a method anymore. It's now a function. And so here, it's a regular function call. And so therefore, the this keyword inside of it will now point to undefined. And that's why I kept telling you earlier that the this keyword depends on how the function is actually called. Okay, so make sure to understand this dynamics here. But now, how do we actually fix this problem? So, in other words, how do we tell JavaScript that we want to create a booking on the new Eurowings airline? Or even, how do we tell it that we want to book on Lufthansa here? Well, basically, we need to tell JavaScript explicitly what the this keyword here should be like. So if we want to book a Lufthansa flight, the this keyword should point to Lufthansa. But if we want to book a Eurowings flight, then the this keyword should point to Eurowings. So how do we do that? How do we tell JavaScript explicitly or manually what the this keyword should look like? Well, there are three function methods to do that, and they are call, apply, and bind. So when we first talked about the this keyword, I think I mentioned these methods back then, and so now we're going to use them, at least the call and apply methods. Okay, so let me show you how. So instead of just doing this, which doesn't work, let's actually comment that out. Does not work. So instead, we use book.call. All right, and remember that a function is really just an object, and objects have methods, and therefore functions can have methods too. And the call method is one of them. And in the call method, the first argument is exactly what we want the this keyword to point to. So let's say we want an Eurowings flight. And then, as usual, the rest of the arguments. So 23 and Sarah Williams. All right. And then let's log to the console also the Eurowings object. Let's run this, and then I will explain a bit better what just happened. But indeed, we now have the bookings array, and in there we have the object with the EW23, and so EW comes from here, so exactly from the Eurowings object, and then also, of course, the name. And again, it is inside the bookings array of the Eurowings object. So let's recap what happened here. So this time we did actually not call the book function ourselves. Instead, we called the call method, and it's then this call method which will call the book function with the this keyword set to 0 wings. So whatever we pass as the first argument of the call method. And so this allows us to manually and explicitly set the this keyword of any function that we want to call. Then all the arguments after the first one are simply the arguments of the original function. And so in the case of the book function, of course, that's the flight number and the passenger name. And of course now we can do the same also for Lufthansa. So book.call, this time with Lufthansa, and let's book someone else on flight 239. Let's say Mary Cooper, and let's log again the Lufthansa object, and let's do it now here. And indeed, this string that we get here is completely correct, and in here, so in the Lufthansa bookings array, we now have, of course, 3 bookings. Okay? And so that, of course, happened because this time we set the this keyword inside of the function call to Lufthansa. And so now this here is again back to pointing to Lufthansa, while before, right here, it was being pointed to Eurowings. All right? So even though the code of this function is inside of the Lufthansa object, we made it so that the this keyword in here pointed to Eurowings. So to this object, this new one right here. Okay? So we have a way now of manually manipulating the this keyword using the call method. And of course, we could now keep going and create more airlines into the Lufthansa group, like the Swiss Airlines, Now, of course, these property names, they all need to have the exact same format as this original object here, because this method is trying to read just these properties. So it's always IATA code and bookings, as you see here, and airline. And so, of course, we need to use exactly these property names here as well. But just like this, we can now go ahead and use our book function on the Swiss airline. And so this time we will set the this keyword in the book call to the Swiss object. 583, and let's book another flight for Mary Cooper here. And indeed it worked again. So here is the booking again. Okay, there's just some weird thing here. And so, oh, actually here it needs to be airline as well. So I was telling you, you need to use the same property names, and I wasn't even doing it myself. So it needs to be airline just like it is here, and the same here too. And now the string is, of course, correct here. Okay, so let me add a comment here. Call method, because in fact there is a similar method to the call method, which is called the apply method. And the apply method does basically exactly the same thing. The only difference is that apply does not receive a list of arguments after the this keyword. So it doesn't receive this list here, but instead it's going to take an array of the arguments. Okay? And so it will then take the elements from that array and pass it into the function. So let's say flight data. So I'm just going to create quickly an array here with the flight number and the passenger name. So book on the same flight, George Cooper. And now we can use apply on the book function. So apply, And then just as here in the call method, the first argument is the this keyword. But now the second argument, it needs to be, as I just said, an array of data. So let's pass in the flight data array here. And then let's just take a look. Let's just take this one here actually. And so, indeed here it worked again. All right. This apply method is not that used anymore in modern JavaScript, because now we actually have a better way of doing the exact same thing. And do you know what I'm talking about? So let me show it to you. Book.call. So instead of using apply, we can still use call, again with Swiss, and then we can simply use the spread operator to take the data out of flight data and basically put them here. So this here is the same as this one. And so right now with modern JavaScript, I prefer to just always use the call method and then spread out the arguments from an array like this. So again, this here is exactly the same as this. So in summary, we now have yet another tool in our toolbox here. And this one is one that allows us to explicitly define the this keyword in any function that we want. But there is actually yet another method which allows us to do the same thing. And that's the bind method. It's more important actually than the call and apply methods, so I'm going to leave it for the next lecture. So let's now learn about the bind method. And just like the call method, bind also allows us to manually set the this keyword for any function call. Now the difference is that bind does not immediately call the function. Instead, it returns a new function where the this keyword is bound. So it's set to whatever value we pass into bind. So let's continue with our airline example from the previous lecture here. And now let's say that we need to use the book function for Eurowings all the time. So remember, we have this Eurowings object, and then we used book.call to use the book function with Eurowings set to the this keyword. So that's what we did in the last lecture. So let me just copy this code here. But now, as I said, we can use the bind method to create a new function with the this keyword also set to Eurowings. All right. So again, this will not call the book function. Instead, it will return a new function where the this keyword will always be set to Eurowings. And so let's create a new function here called book EW, which is the code of Eurowings. All right. And so now let's use this function. So book EW Stephen Williams, and we're missing the flight number here. So 23. And so as you see, this now looks like the normal book function call again. And that's because this function here already has the this keyword set in stone, basically. And so here, of course, we no longer need to specify the this keyword again. So the signature here, so the name of the parameters, is back to being simply the flight number and the passenger name. Okay, and so now again we see that Stephen booked a seat on Eurowings flight EW23. And so that worked perfectly. Let's also, of course, see the object again. So with all the bookings, and indeed, here is Stephen Williams in the flight that we just booked. Great. So this is really, really useful. And we could now, of course, go ahead and do the same for all the airlines. So creating one booking function for each of the airlines. And this then makes it a little bit easier to book a flight for each of the airlines if we have to do it multiple times. So instead of having to use a call all the time we can just do bind once. So defining the this keyword once, like this, and from there on, we can then always use these functions. Dot bind, and this one, Swiss. All right. Now I'm not going to use them all here now because we already know how that works. All right. So this is great, but we can actually take this even further. So in the call method, we can pass multiple arguments here beside the this keyword, right? And so in the bind method, we can actually do the same. And then all of these arguments will also be basically set in stone. So they will be defined, and the function will then always be called with these same arguments. For example, we could use bind to create a function for one specific airline and a specific flight number. So let's say book EW, just like we had here, but then really specific only for flight 23. So that would be book.bind. And then of course we have to again define Eurowings, but then we can start defining the list of arguments or the list of parameters and setting the first one to 23. Okay. And so if we look at our bind function now, remember that it needs the flight number and the name. But now in our book EW23 function, it is as if this first argument was already set. And so our remaining function now only needs the name. So this function, this one now only needs the name because the number was already preset here in the bind method. So let's see. So our newly created function book EW23, and let's now book a flight for myself. And let's book a flight for Martha, let's say Cooper. And yeah, let's check out our output here. And so these are the two. And indeed, both of them are for Eurowings flight EW23. All right. And so that's exactly what we were expecting. Again, because we preset that 23 right here. If we preset this here to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, then of course, both of these new flights here would be booked onto that flight number. Okay, so this allows us to set in stone certain arguments, and so this function, the resulting function, then becomes even simpler. So right now, all we need to pass in is the passenger name, right? And then everything else basically happens automatically. And taking this even further, we could even define the passenger name here, for example, like this. And then this function would always book a flight for Jonas on flight 23. But that would probably take it a little bit too far. Oh, and I deleted the 23 here. Of course, I didn't want that. So this is correct. And by the way, what we did here, so basically specifying parts of the argument beforehand, is actually a common pattern called partial application. So essentially, partial application means that a part of the arguments of the original function are already applied. So which means already set. And so that's exactly what the book EW23 function is, right? It's essentially the book function, but with 23 already predefined. Great. So hopefully this was a nice example for you to understand the call, apply, and bind methods. But there are also other situations in which we can use the bind method and where it is very useful. And one example of that is when we use objects together with event listeners. So let's write that here actually. With event listeners. And so now this button here will finally come into play, and maybe you've been wondering about that. But let's start by adding a new property only to the Lufthansa object, and let's set it to 300. So meaning that this company has 300 planes. And then we also add a new method only to the Lufthansa object, which is to buy a new plane. So function, and now what we want to do is this dot planes plus plus. So essentially we want to add a new plane whenever we click on this button. So eventually that's what we will want to do. And then let's also log this dot planes to the console, and probably we should also log the this keyword to the console as well. And now let's actually attach our event handler to this element. Let's inspect it here. Okay, should need to go to elements. So this is the button here, and it has the class buy. So document.query selector .buy, add event listener for click, and then the second argument, as you already know, is the handler function. So add event listener here is the higher order function which receives a callback function. And so that should be Lufthansa.buyPlane. .buyPlane. All right, so essentially this function here is what we want to happen, which again takes the current number of planes and increases it by 1. So let's do that. And now as I click on this button, let's see what happens. And we get not a number here. So this dot planes is now not a number. And the reason for that is that the this keyword is this button element. Okay. And do you know why that is? Well, in one of the theory lectures, we learned that in an event handler function, the this keyword always points to the element on which that handler is attached to. So this is the handler function, right? And so it is attached to this element, so to this button. And therefore, inside of the handler function or the event listener, it doesn't really matter, but inside of this function, the this keyword will point to the button element. And so that's why this keyword here returns this button. Okay? So here you have yet another proof that the this keyword really is set dynamically. Because if we simply called Lufthansa.buyPlane out here, then of course the this keyword would be Lufthansa, so this object, right? Because that's the object calling the function. But in this case, it's of course this event listener function calling this function. And so therefore, the button itself will then become the this keyword. Okay? Here we now see the result of calling this function out here. And so now we started with 300 and it was increased just as we wanted it to be. So let's take this out here and let's go back to clicking here to see the result we had before. So that's this button. Now, of course, in this handler function here, we still need the this keyword to point to the Lufthansa object itself, right? Otherwise, this logic here will not work. So what this means is that we need to manually define the this keyword right here. So right here. Now, how should we do that? Should we use the call method or the bind method? Well, we need to pass in a function here and not to call it. And so we already know that the call method calls the function. And so that's not what we need. And so therefore we use bind, because we already know that bind is going to return a new function. And so the this keyword should be Lufthansa. And so that's exactly what we define. Okay, and now as we click here, we should see the Lufthansa object being the this keyword. Indeed, that's now exactly what we got here. So that's the result of this line of code. And so again, this now points to Lufthansa, because that's what we told JavaScript to do right here. And so indeed now the number of planes is increasing each time that we click on this button. Great, so we have our problem solved, and in fact we will do this a couple more times throughout the course. So this one is an important one, and in general the bind method is something you really need to understand. Alright, now just one final example here, which is again going to be about partial application, because this is another big use case for the bind method. And in this case of partial application, many times we are not even interested in the this keyword, but we still use bind for this. All right. Now remember that partial application means that we can preset parameters. All right. So let's start by creating a general function which adds a tax to some value. So let's start with the tax rate and then the value itself. And let's write an arrow function here. And so this works by doing value plus value times the tax rate, right? So imagine that the tax rate would be 10% and the value 100. And so adding the tax to 100 would be 110. Well, let's actually do 200 to make it a bit more clear. And of course, we need to call the function here itself. Okay, so now 10% of 200 is 20, and so the result should be 220. And that didn't work. And yeah, that's because we need to define this here as a decimal number here, of course. So only then this rate here can make sense. Okay, so 220 now. So this here is the general function for adding tax. But now let's say that there is one tax that we use all the time. And so let's create a function for that. So for example, here in Portugal, the VAT, which is value added tax, is 23%. And so we can now use the bind function on this function and preset the rate always, so that it always will be this 23%. And then we have a function which only calculates the VAT for whatever value we pass into it. So add tax dot bind, and then the first argument of bind is the this keyword. Remember? But in this case, we don't care about the this keyword at all. It's not even here in the function. And so we just say null. It could be any other value because nothing will happen with it, but it's kind of a standard to just use null. And now we can set the rate here. So let's preset it to 23%, so 0.23. All right, and so this sets the rate value here in stone. So essentially this would be the same as writing, let's paste it here. So this would be add VAT equals, and the rate is preset to 0.23. So this is essentially what our add VAT function now looks like. Okay? So because we already set 0.23 in stone. So now we can start using that. So this should be 123, and it is. We can use anything we want now, like 23, and so on and so forth. So I hope this makes sense. When you want to do this yourself, just keep in mind that the order of the arguments then is important. If you wanted to preset the rate, then it has to be the first argument in this function. Otherwise, this will not really work here. Okay? Now you could argue that what we just did here could easily have been done with default parameters. But this is actually different, because this here is creating a brand new, simply more specific function based on a more general function, which is the add tax function. And of course, the example here could be a lot more complex too, right? So this really is different, because using bind actually really gives us a new function. So it's as if we returned a new specific function from the add text function. And actually now I have a nice challenge for you, which is to essentially rewrite this whole example here, but using the technique of one function returning another function. So we have one lecture about that, and maybe you can go back and take a look at that. And then I want you to essentially create a function that can return a function which will do just what this one does. So that's probably really challenging. So don't beat yourself up if you cannot do it. I know it is a challenge, but you can still try to take a minute or two and really try it. If you can't do it, then just watch the solution in a minute. Okay? Just don't use bind, of course, because with that we already have the solution. So use the technique that I showed you earlier with the greet function, remember. And so here you can do something similar. So see you in a second with the solution. All right, I hope you tried that out. And here is how I would have done it. So the first function here, I'm going to call it add text rate. And I could do this with the arrow functions, but then that looks really confusing. So let's just focus on the functionality here. So this is the first function which only receives the rate. So similar to what we did here. And then what it does is to return a new function. And then this new function is the one that takes in the value. And it will then return, just as the other function, value plus value times the rate. Okay. And so now based on this one, we could create add VAT2. And so that would be add tax rate and then call it with 0.23. And then let's just do the same to see if the results are the same. So VAT2 and 2, give it a try, and here you go. So the results are the same. And so this add VAT2 is the same function as this one. So just to recap, we created this function which then returns this one. So the first one is the one that needs the rate, because the rate is also what we used to define this add VAT function here, right? And so the resulting function is then the one who takes in the value. And that's why we have value here in the inner function too. Now this is just another way of doing the same thing, and this is already pretty advanced stuff, really. So absolutely don't be upset if you didn't do this by yourself. But anyway, in the next video, we have coding challenge number 1 of this section coming up. And so I hope to see you there very soon. Welcome to the first coding challenge of this section. And this one is going to be an exciting one. Because in this one, we are building a simple poll application. So a poll has a question, an array of options from which people can choose, and an array with the number of replies for each option. And this data is stored in this object here that I already created for you. Now you can copy this object from here, or you can get it from the final code that's available for the section in the GitHub repository. Okay, so you see we have the question, the array of options, and also a new array of answers. So this code here, we will learn how it works in the next lecture, but this will create this array of 4 zeros. And that's because there are 4 options here for this question. And now here are your tasks. So first up, in that poll object, create a new method called register new answer. And this method does 2 things. So it displays a prompt window for the user to input the number of the selected option. And here I want the text to look exactly like this. Then, based on the inputted number, so the user should input either 0, 1, 2, or 3. So based on that, update the answers array. So if the user gives 3 here as the option, then increase the value at the position 3 of the array. And of course, increase that by 1. To do this, make sure that the input is actually a number and if that number makes sense. Then I want you to call this method whenever the user clicks on this button. And so this is where the second button here comes into play. Then number 3, create a method called display results. And this one should, as the name says, display the results of the poll. Now this method takes an argument called type, and that type should be a string, as I say here. And the value of that string should either be string or array. So these are 2 different ways of displaying the results, basically. Now, if the type is set to the string of array, then simply display the results array as it is using a normal console.log. And this should actually be the default option. All right. Now, if the type is set to string, then display a string like this one here. Okay. And then once you have this method built, run it each time after the register new answer. So essentially, whenever someone clicks on this button here, it will call this this register new answer method, and then this method itself will call display results. Okay? And to do this, use as many of the tools that you learned in this section, and probably also the last sections, and really all the course itself. Now, there are a lot of moving parts in this challenge, and it might not be as straightforward as it seems here. So if you need to cut some corners and make some things a little bit easier, then that's absolutely no problem. At least just write some code on your own. That's really my main goal with this challenge. Then if you manage to do these challenges, or to do the challenge as instructed here, then I also have a bonus for you. And so that is to use this display results method that you built before to display these 2 arrays that we have here in the test data. Okay? So usually you simply use this method to display the answers array that's inside of the object. But here I want you to really display simply this array and this array. And of course, do not put this array here inside of this poll object. Okay? You should use them individually. Now, for doing this, you have to really think about what the this keyword should look like in this situation. And then you basically need to set the this keyword accordingly. Okay? So that's a nice challenge here. And one thing that is certain is that your code will look different than mine. I'm just a normal developer like anyone else, and everybody writes their own code. And so my code is different from everyone else's code, probably. And so, yeah, that's completely normal if you are starting to develop your own style. So take maybe an hour even to do all of this, and then come back to this video to check out my solution. So let's get to work here. I hope it went well for you when you tried it out on your own, and you can always share your experience in the Q&A area. Anyway, let's now get the answer here. And so for that we use prompt. So const answer prompt. And so let's see what it has to look like. So it's just a question, then it's a new line, then it's these options, another new line, and then write option number. So this part is always the same, so I'm just copying it from here. So we want to grab the question first, and so that is this dot question, then the new line, which is this, remember, then we want the options, and so one new line for each of these options here. So this is an array. We want to transform it to a string. And so for that, we use the join method. So this one we learned about in the previous section. So I hope you remember this one. And so we take the options array here and join it. And we do join it again by the new line character. Okay. And then finally another new line. And then this part. All right. Oh, and then we of course also need to convert this result to a number. All right. So this looks good. Let's just add a comment here. So this is get the answer. And then here, second is to register. I think that's what we had here. So the first step is to get the answer, and the second is to basically update the answers. So I'm just calling that register the answer. Okay, but here let's actually start by trying it out. So let's do for now Paul.register new answer. And indeed, this is exactly the formatting we were looking for. Let's say 3, and indeed we get 3. Nice. And so now let's register the answer. And remember that we should check if this value is actually a number and also if it makes actually sense. So in terms of the number of options. So first we check if it is indeed a number. And there are better ways of checking this, but more about that later. And we also want to know if the answer is below the length of this array, basically. Right? So if the answer is 10, then that doesn't make any sense. And so it must stay below the length. So the length here is 4. And so the max reply that we accept is 3. So answer needs to stay below this.answers.length. Now here we could now do an if statement and basically saying that if this is true, then increase the answers array at the correct position. However, instead, this is actually a great use case for short-circuiting with the AND operator. So let's simply do this. So this.answers, and then we go to the position of answer, and then simply increase it like this. All right. So if this here is true, then the AND operator will keep going, right? So then this is evaluated, and if it's still true, then this here is executed. But if either one of these conditions here is false, then the AND operator will short circuit, and this part here is not executed. So this is a nice use case for short circuiting, because the code that we want to execute is just one simple line of code. Okay, so now let's then take a look at the answers. So this.answers. So this is for now the register new answer method. And now let's focus here on point number 2, which is to actually call the method whenever we click on this answer button here. So let's select that button, document.query selector, and now we need the class name. Let's check that out here again in the elements. And so it has the class of Paul. So Paul.add event listener, click, and now the function that we want to execute. And so that is add Paul.register new answer. All right. Now, do you think that this will work like this? And let's give it a save, actually. And there is an error, and that's because we're trying to read property join of undefined right here. And so the problem here is, as you might have guessed, because we talked about this before, is that the this keyword right now points to this element, so to this poll button here. And so again, that is because in an event handler function, such as this one here, the this keyword will always point to the element to which it is attached. And so right now, that is this button. So to fix this, we need to bind the this keyword, and in this case, we need to set it to the poll object. And so then, in this function here, which is the result of the bind method, so in this new function, the this keyword will then point to the poll object. So let's see that, and now indeed it works. So let's input 0 here, and indeed, we already get our array where the count of the answers in position 0 has increased. And if we try this again, it should become 2, and it does. Now, in order to actually display these results, we should create this new method called display results. All right. So it takes a string that is called type, with array being the default here. All right. So let's do this. And also keep in mind that this is the kind of string that we want if the type is string. So let's copy this one. And now here we add that new method called display results. And so it gets the type. And remember, it has the default set to array. And so here we can use the ES6 default parameters using this equal sign. So if type equals array, then simply log this dot answers to the console. Else, if the type equals a string, then we want to log something like this to the console. So once more, a template string or template literal, and actually this should be outside results are, and then do create this here. We can simply join the array together to form a string. So that's this dot results, or actually answers, dot join, and we join them with a comma and a space. Okay, and so now here, let's get rid of this console.log, and instead we will now call this method. So this dot display results, and let's actually call it twice. Once without passing any argument, and then here passing in string. And so then we will see both types of results printed to the console. And so this is number 4 here. So let's give it a save. 0, and indeed it works just the same. 3, let's try 3 again, and so indeed it works just fine. Let me now input something else, and so then nothing changes here. So the results are not updated, and that's because of this testing logic that we have here. Great. So I hope you have been following this far. So this is similar to what we have been doing. And now let's check out the bonus here. So let's use the display results method that we just used, but to display these 2 arrays. Okay, let's copy them just so we don't have to scroll so much. And it says here that we should think about what the this keyword will look like. So we will do that, of course. Okay, so these are the arrays that we're going to work with. So the method is at poll.displayResults. But as I said, now we want to call this method here not with this array, so not with the answers array, but instead with this array. So what should we do here? Well, we will have to use the call method because we will need a new this keyword, right? Because display results uses this.answers. Okay, so the answers come from the this keyword. And so if we want to have a different this keyword, then we need to use call. And what should the this keyword be like? Well, we need an object which contains the answers property here, right? Otherwise, there is no way for this method to call this.answers. And so we can simply create a new object and say answers and then this array. And that's it. Let's try this. And indeed, here is the result printed. And let's even now pass in the string option. And so now indeed we get poll results are 5, 2, and 3. All right. So again, to recap, this works because this function here is looking for this.answers. But our array is, well, it's simply out here. So we need a way to make this.answers equal to this array. And so that's why we used the call method here, so that we could manually set the this keyword to a new object, which as the answers property has that new array. And now let's just try it with the other one here. And we can do the same without the string, and then it will just log the array itself. And yeah, that works just fine. Great. Now, what we did here is not really a real scenario, but it's still good for us to use these concepts in some different ways to really get used to how all of these concepts work together.